Please enjoy the story Drowning. Item number 001. Case No. D327HL. Item number 001. A page from Brooke Rhodes Bishop's Journal, dated July 17, 2015. Recently, I've done a lot of research on drowning, and here is what I've learned. It takes the average person 10 minutes to drown. Actually, drowning, however, takes a lifetime. The act of dying is strangely similar to the performance of living. At first, you struggle. You resist what you are told, and you pull away from what is expected. You don't want to give in to the empty feeling in your chest, but soon you submit. You stop holding your breath, and by instinct, you inhale. The water burns, but it's peaceful. You grow used to the feeling of your lungs slowly filling. You stop fighting. In that small lifetime between life and death, everything comes back slowly. It doesn't flash before your eyes in a stream of bright colors and vivid memories. Your life trickles by slowly, like water filling your entire body. I first hit the water in the middle of December, and slipping beneath the surface in sub-freezing temperatures slows everything down: your thoughts, your heartbeat, your resistance. It's downright deadly. Minute 1. December 12, 2007. 1828. He was dark. That was the only way Brooke could think to describe him. No one would look at her and call her bright, but he made her look like a sunrise. For the longest time, he made her feel like a sunrise too. It began on a Monday night after class, and Brooke felt like she couldn't breathe. Astrid and Jeremiah had left for his dorm, and she was alone. She'd been alone most of her life, but this night was different. The walls had felt like they were slowly moving closer, and she knew she needed to get out. Do something. Do anything. The pier was a 10-minute walk from campus, and it wasn't a particular hot spot during the weeknights. The railings were weak, and the vendors were rude. Seagulls were conditioned not to mind pedestrians, so patrons often found themselves shielding their lunch from a low-flying bird. Still, when the sun was just beginning to set and the lights lining the wooden boards were flickering to life, the place was almost comforting. Brooke walked with her head down, trying to time her steps so each foot landed fully on the wooden slats, avoiding stepping on any cracks. She pulled her jacket tighter around her body to shield from a biting sea breeze, but movement from the corner of her vision caught her attention. Looking up, she noticed the shadow of a man stumbling a dozen paces to her right. It was hard to make out his features in the darkness, and when he tripped into the light cast by a passing lamp, she could only make out a blur of dark hair and a shadow of stubble across his jaw. He had yet to notice her, so Brooke hesitantly moved closer, watching as he moved slowly, languidly, drunkenly across the slats of wood, the toe of his shoe occasionally catching on the two white gaps. "Damn it," he murmured, catching himself on a lamp post when he tripped for the fourth time. Brooke hadn't noticed before, but he'd had a bottle in his hand, and when he'd moved to catch himself, it had shattered against the post. He paused, looking at the broken glass in his palm, and then he started punching the lamp post. "Damn it! Damn it! Damn it! Damn it!" he shouted, getting louder with each fruitless swing. As he attacked the post, he wavered dangerously close to the breaking railings that lined the pier. One misstep could have him stumbling over the edge. Without realizing what she was doing, Brooke took a step forward into the light. Finally sensing he had an audience, he suddenly stopped his assault, squinting in Brooke's direction. "Hello," he called, moving away from the lamp. She noticed his hand was bleeding, and she took another step closer. Narrowing her eyes against the light now cast across her face, Brooke caught his sharp intake of breath. She ignored his wide-eyed stare when she said, "You're going to drown yourself if you go any closer to the edge." She extended her hand toward him, but he didn't show any signs of moving. "You're bleeding," she explained. Rather than offering her his hand, he held it against his chest and continued his appraisal. His dark eyes swept over her features in disbelief, and Brooke tried to recall having met him before, but her mind came back blank. "You're—" he started slowly, then shook his head. More to himself than her he mumbled, "I'm seeing things." Brooke took another step closer to him, and the glass from the broken bottle crunched under her feet. She moved slowly, as if she were approaching a wounded animal. "Palms up in a sign of mitigation," she told him. "I'm a nursing student. Please, let me see your hand. You have glass in your cut." She must have said the wrong thing because he straightened and stumbled back a step. She was shocked to hear him emit a harsh laugh. "I don't need some little girl telling me what to do," he snapped, voice surprisingly clear for his inebriated state. He took another backward step and would have fallen against the precarious railing had Brooke not rushed forward to catch the fist he'd thrown up in drunken anger. Once she'd steadied him, she quickly dropped his hand and tilted her head back to meet his gaze. Brooke decided he was maybe a year older than her at most, but his tall, swaying figure made him imposing. He looked down at her, breath ragged, but this close. His eyes revealed what the dark must have hidden this entire time: thinly disguised fear. For some reason, he was absolutely terrified. Still breathing heavily, he whispered, "What's your name?" After half a heartbeat, she told him. "Brooke," she admitted. "Brooke Rhodes." "Brooke." He repeated her name as an exhale, and he tipped his head toward the dark sky, running his good hand along his face. When he looked back down at her, it was between long fingers. "I'm very drunk, Brooke." She tilted her head to the side. "Let me help you then." After a deep, shuddering breath, he nodded. Holding his injured hand by his wrist, Brooke led him to a bench she felt was a comfortable distance from the edge of the pier. Gingerly setting his hand in her lap, she began to assess the damage done to his palm. She wrinkled her nose as she twisted his hand to one side then the other, looking at the broken glass from varying angles. He didn't move as she did this, but Brooke felt his heavy gaze as she turned to her bag in search of something. "You keep tweezers in your purse?" It was a statement, not a question. When she glanced up from his hand, she noticed any residual anger had been replaced with exhausted amusement. The effects of the alcohol seemed to be fading. Brooke shrugged, turning back to his hand. "I like to be prepared," he grunted as she removed a particularly large shard of glass. It was silent save their out-of-sync breaths and the sound of waves sloshing against the posts of the pier. Finally, he asked, "Why are you helping me?" She chose to ignore him, instead retrieving a bottle of water from her bag and saying, "This might sting." She held his hand over the ground and poured the entire bottle over his wound, his blood mixing with the water in a clear pink runoff. He didn't flinch, and when she glanced at him from the corner of her eye, he was staring at their cupped hands. Capping the water bottle, Brooke tossed it back into her purse and told him that she didn't have a bandage large enough to cover the cut on his hand. "It's not deep," she added, "but I would wrap it in gauze when you get home." He nodded slowly, cradling the injured hand to his chest. "Thank you," he mumbled, looking straight ahead. When she followed his gaze, Brooke could only see the crashing waves beyond the pier. She glanced back at him, taking a moment to admire his profile. Before he had been covered in shadow, his expression darkened by the alcohol, but when his mouth wasn't twisted into a scowl, she had to admit that he was handsome. Dark hair and even darker eyes that appeared obsidian in the low pier lighting. Most likely feeling the weight of her gaze, he looked away from the water to face her. "I'm sorry I yelled at you," he said softly, leveling his dark eyes with hers. "It's just," he scanned her face, desperately drinking in her features. "You look so much like her." Brooke opened her mouth to respond, and she almost pushed him to explain what he meant, but then decided against it. He was still obviously drunk, and as his eyes swept over her once more, she realized his confusion was almost edged in a barely visible sadness. Without breaking his gaze, she said, "My brother died 3 years ago, today. Sometimes I'll see someone and think that it's him, but it never island." It wasn't a question, but it was an invitation. It took him a moment to react, and she watched as realization slowly washed over his face. His eyes darted between both of hers as if he couldn't decide where to settle his gaze. "1 year ago," he finally said, then added, "today." Brooke tried to school her features, but she didn't think she hit her shock well. It seemed they'd both come here for the same reason, some less sober than others. "What was her name?" she whispered. His mouth twisted, and she didn't expect him to respond. He surprised her again, though. "Missing in action," he said, and he lifted a hand to run a calloused thumb across the sensitive skin along her cheekbone. Brooke froze. He swallowed, his Adam's apple working in his throat. "She had your eyes," he whispered. He didn't move, so she didn't move either. His hand stayed there, cradling her cheek, and she didn't realize she was moving closer until her eyes were nearly crossed in their attempt not to break his gaze. "What is your name?" she breathed, and her heart was pounding out of her chest. Brooke wasn't sure how she ended up on a bench with this stranger, eyelashes close enough to count, but she wasn't pulling away. His breath fanned across her cheeks, and she felt it stutter when she spoke. He closed his eyes and seemed to be debating something. Dark brows furrowed. He exhaled what must have been all the air left in his lungs. When he opened his eyes again, his pupils nearly swallowed his entire iris. This close, though, Brooke could see that they were brown. This close she could see they were apologetic. "I'm sorry," he said, and before she could react, he pushed himself to his feet and began to walk away from their bench, away from the pier and toward solid land. His stride seemed steadier, and she realized that the alcohol must have lost its initial effect. Just before he disappeared into the shadows beyond the yellow light from the pier's lamps, he turned. "Thank you, Brooke Rhodes." "You're welcome." She trailed off when she realized he still hadn't given her his name. He was gone without filling in the blank, and, by instinct, she inhaled the gasp of air she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Menu 2. February 26, 2008. 21:54. Astrid had dragged Brooke to a party where she knew maybe 5 people out of 100, and 2 of them were currently chest to chest in the living room, deep in the middle of a heated make-out session. Brooke leaned farther into the arm of the sofa they were sharing, wrinkling her nose as Jeremiah slid a hand under the hem of Astrid's shirt. Finally giving up on the idea that either of her friends would be acknowledging her anytime soon, she pushed herself to her feet and went searching for one of the 3 remaining people she may know as this party. Wandering into the kitchen, she squeezed past another pair pressed against the sink and went searching through the large cooler for something to drink. When she straightened, Brooke found herself facing the boy from her English class. "Cameron," she said with a smile, using the sleeve of her sweater as a cushion for her sweating beer bottle. "Hey." He trailed off, and Brooke's smile faltered. "Brooke," she reminded him. He snapped his fingers in remembrance and pointed at her. "Hill's British Literature," he guessed, and she nodded. "You lent me the last book because you'd already finished it?" She shrugged. "I like to read ahead." "You saved my ass," Cameron told her, popping the top off his beer and tilting it toward her in salute. "It was no problem," she promised. He lifted the bottle to his lips and blatantly looked her up and down. She tried to cover her embarrassment at being so obviously checked out by watching her fingers as they fidgeted on the neck of her beer. When she looked back up, one side of Cameron's mouth was pulled up in the crooked grin. "You're here alone?" he asked. She shook her head. "My friends are somewhere plastered against each other in another room." "So, you're here alone?" Brooke leaned back against the kitchen island with a small laugh. "Pretty much," she said, and they fell into easy conversation. She kept trying to bring the topic back to a recently assigned paper, but she started to sense from the way he balanced one hand on the counter next to her hips that he wasn't too interested in discussing the Class 6. "Which play do you think you'll choose to analyze?" she asked, smiling kindly as she moved her arm away from his hand, which was slowly inching closer. "What are you doing tonight?" Cameron asked, ignoring her question entirely. Brooke winced, searching her mind for an excuse when someone joined them in the kitchen, saving her from having to trip over her own words. Surreptitiously moving away from Cameron's arms, Brooke was surprised to see who exactly had entered the kitchen. The boy from the pier paused in the doorway, an empty bottle in his hand. His gaze cut from Brooke to Cameron and back to Brooke. "Hey," Brooke said with a smile. "It's you." She saw Cameron give her an odd look out of the corner of her eye, but she didn't look away as the other boy nodded to her, crossing the room to find another drink. "It's me," he said, not meeting her gaze, and Brooke didn't have enough time to react as he pulled another beer from the cooler and left the room as swiftly as he'd entered. "Weird guy," Cameron said, trying to pull Brooke's attention away from the kitchen door and back toward him. "Is that your boyfriend?" Brooke caught the jealous tone in his voice, and she finally turned to face him. "No," she said honestly. "Do you know him?" Cameron shrugged. "He shows up at a lot of these parties. I've never really seen him talk to anyone, but he can really hold his alcohol." Brooke pulled her eyebrows together, thinking back to that night she'd met him almost 3 months ago. She didn't want to know how much alcohol he'd needed to appear as drunk as he was. "I'll be right back," Brooke lied, ignoring Cameron's sounds of protest and pushing open the kitchen door. The music was louder out here, but Brooke disregarded its deafening volume, eyes sweeping the length of the room. Finally, she spotted him leaning against the far wall, his beer pressed against his lips. As she moved closer, Brooke noticed it was already halfway empty. He raised his eyes when he noticed her approaching. "Brooke Rhodes," he said when she was standing in front of him. He titled his bottle toward her in greeting. "You never told me your name." He shrugged. "I didn't think it was important. But knowing my name was. It was very important for me." Brooke frowned, but then she remembered what he'd told her that night. "You look so much like her." He'd needed to confirm he wasn't seeing a ghost, He wanted to know that she was real, but now Brooke had no excuse to have his name, and she didn't know why she was desperately searching for one. "How's your hand?" she asked instead, her gaze dropping to the hand holding his beer. He passed his drink to his other hand and flexed his fingers, showing Brooke that it was fine. "Functional," he told her. She noticed a thin, pale scar running the length of his palm when he spread the fingers wide, and she would have mistaken it for a lifeline had she not been looking closely enough. "That's good," she said, and before she could stop herself, she added, "And how are you?" His mouth twisted into a grimace, and Brooke knew he hadn't taken her question as commonly used small talk. He understood exactly what she'd meant by the question. Brooke willed his eyes to meet hers, but his gaze was trained somewhere over her shoulder, and then his brows furrowed. "I think someone's trying to get your attention," he said, and Brooke turned around to see Astrid on tiptoes, trying to be seen over the crowd. Her waves grew more frantic when she noticed Brooke looking her way, and she beckoned her over with a flap of her hands. Brooke's gaze jumped from her friend to the boy beside her, and she noticed how relieved he appeared to have avoided this conversation. Brooke frowned and tried not to be hurt by his relief. She knew firsthand how painful it was to be pushed on something like this. She wanted to remember that first conversation on the pier in its entirety, but as more time passed, she felt the memory of it slipping away like water between her fingers. "Missing in action," she reminded herself. He'd said her name was Missing in Action. "You should probably go before she makes it all the way over here," he said, bringing Brooke back to the present. He inclined his head in Astrid's direction as she pushed through the crowd, trying to get to Brooke. Brooke easily understood the subtext of his words. "Do you want to explain how we know each other?" "I should," she said. "Maybe I'll see you around campus," she supplied, but she knew the chances were slim. He seemed like the type of person who, if he didn't want to be found, he wouldn't. "Maybe," he offered, finishing the rest of his beer and setting the now empty bottle on a nearby table. Brooke turned to go, but before she could push her way into the crowd, his voice caused her to glance one last time over her shoulder. "My name is Adrian." He didn't offer a last name, and Brooke knew why. He must share a first name with a dozen other students on campus. Still, she smiled. "Goodbye, Adrian." "Goodbye, Brooke Rhodes." When Brooke turned back around, she didn't make it 3 steps before she bumped into her friend, placing steadying hands on her shoulders so she didn't fall over. "Where's Jer?" Brooke asked, steering Astrid away from the crowded living room. They settled on the stairs, and Astrid leaned against the railing to face Brooke. "He's grabbing us a drink." "Who was that?" She hooked a thumb back in the direction of the room they'd just left, although neither could see Adrian through the doorway. Brooke wouldn't be surprised if he'd left as soon as she'd turned away. Brooke shrugged, but her friend frowned, prompting her to offer a better response. "Just another drunk." "He was." Brooke searched her mind for the right words to describe Adrian. Finally, she settled with, "He was difficult." "Most of them are, but he was hot." "Are you so obsessed with me that you talk about me when I leave for 5 minutes?" Jeremiah asked, rounding the banister with 2 beers and a lopsided grin. Astrid smiled up at him from her position of the steps, reaching forward so she could grab the front of his shirt and tug him down to her level for a peck on the lips. "I also keep a shrine back in the dorms," she joked, and he turned to Brooke with wide eyes. "Seriously?" he whispered for confirmation. Brooke laughed and took one of the cups from his hand, taking a quick sip. "Oh, definitely. Item number 004. Case No. D327HL. Item number 004. Seized from Adrian Bishop August 3, 2015. Description: the photograph from Bishop's wallet is dated December 10, 2006. The girl in the picture is between the ages of 16 and 18, of medium height and build, black hair, blue eyes. She looks like she may be related to Rhodes Bishop. There are indentations on the back of the photograph to indicate someone has written on it, but the words have since faded. Minute 3. April 15, 2010. 1908. Every so often, the Carnival managed to set itself up on the rickety old pier without the entire structure collapsing from the weight of skeet-ball machines and target water gun booths. The majority of the time, Brooke avoided going with Astrid and Jeremiah on their It's Totally Not a Date Brooke outings, but tonight Astrid had begged since it was their last week before finals. Brooke realized that almost a year from now they would be graduating, and she wasn't sure where life would lead them afterward. In the end, she agreed to go to the pier with her friends. "Look," Astrid said, popping another piece of the cotton candy the three had been sharing into her mouth and pointing toward a large structure just off the edge of the pier. They managed to get the Ferris wheel running. Brooke followed her extended hand, her eyes falling on the large, rotating wheel lit up and mobile in the night sky. All her time on campus, Brooke had never seen the wheel operating, and while she watched its red and white lights dance along the swinging carts, she was filled with an indescribable sense of dread. "Are you sure it's safe?" she asked, knowing without looking that Astrid was giddy to use tickets on the metal death trap. "Why wouldn't it be?" Astrid grabbed Jeremiah's hand and pulled him down the pier and toward the amusement ride, prompting him to cast Brooke a sympathetic expression that asked, "What can you do?" Brooke sighed and hesitantly followed. Once the trio made it to the front of the line, Brooke having nervously tapped her foot the entire time, the man operating the Ferris wheel informed them that it was only 2 to a cart. Brooke let out a breath of relief as Astrid tried to convince the worker otherwise. "We can squeeze in, I'm barely a full person, really," she said, gesturing to her small 5-foot frame. "Sorry," the man said gruffly, his voice holding anything but sympathy. Brooke noticed his red employee's shirt was wrinkled and riddled with grease stains. "It's okay," Brooke told the pair earnestly, seizing upon the opportunity to escape the line and leave the Ferris wheel behind. "You two can go alone, and I'll stay down here on the solid, safe ground." Astrid's frown deepened, and Jeremiah snaked an arm around her slim waist. "We don't have to do it," she said, her disappointment evident in her tone. Brooke distantly realized that they were currently holding up the line, and the worker taking tickets looked even more annoyed than he had a minute before. Brooke dismissed her with a wave of her hand, gesturing toward the Ferris wheel as she slipped under the rope dividers that funneled the line toward the entrance of the ride. "You should go," she said. "I'll get us some more cotton candy." "Are you sure?" Astrid asked, chewing on her bottom lip to hide her excited smile. Brooke's lips tugged at the corners when she saw Jeremiah roll his eyes behind his girlfriend's head. They both knew she would end up on the right, regardless. Brooke's answer. "Go?" she demanded with a smile, backing up a few steps. She hadn't made it 3 feet before Astrid had grabbed Jeremiah's hand, shoving their tickets toward the grumpy worker and dragging Jeremiah into the next available cart. Brooke was shaking her head in slight amusement as she walked a little ways down the pier, coming upon a vendor that was selling bags of pink and blue cotton candy. Pointing out what she wanted, Brooke was rifling through her change purse to pay the man when she heard someone behind her approach the booth. Brooke Rhodes. Forehead folding in recognition, Brooke turned around, finally connecting the face to that slow, deep voice. It had been a few years since she'd last seen him, but Brooke didn't think she could forget the boy in front of her. For some reason, he'd made a lasting impression. "Adrian," she said, hesitantly offering him a smile. Brooke would have been lying had she said she hadn't tried looking for him after their last meeting at that party. There were thousands of students on their campus, and he'd only given her his first name, but for the next few months until the summer break, Brooke found herself scanning crowds of students for his familiar dark hair and even darker eyes. Obviously, her attempts had been fruitless until now. "I thought maybe you'd graduated." She quickly finished paying the vendor and faced Adrian again, her cotton candy in hand. I tried looking for you." "It's good to see you," she said instead. He shook his head. "This is my last year." Brooke dismissed the sinking feeling in her stomach at the realization that she'd finally found this elusive boy when he was leaving in less than a month. Maybe it was a sign that her initial gut feeling was right. He was better off a mystery. "Congratulations," she offered, and he nodded to her in response. Brooke had to suppress wrinkling her nose in disgust when Adrian moved past her to order something from the booth. He smelled strongly of alcohol and cigarettes. Was he ever sober? When he turned back to her, he had a soft pretzel in one hand. He took a bite of the pretzel and looked at her oddly. Before Brooke could ask him what was wrong, he answered her unspoken question. "I've thought about you." "You have?" she asked, clearly surprised. He nodded. "You're hard to forget. I remember our night at the pier. Well, despite extenuating circumstances," he added with a sardonic twisting of his lips. Brooke thought that it almost counted as a smile. "I couldn't find you," she admitted as he finished his pretzel and tossed the foil it had been wrapped in into a nearby trash can. "I'm here now," he said, meeting her eyes. "At the pier, of all places. This is very full circle." An almost nostalgic smile pulled at her lips. "It is." His voice trailed off as he looked past her, gaze falling somewhere on the dark horizon beyond the low lights and sloshing waves. Slowly, Adrian turned to face her again, and his gaze was almost clear enough to be deceptive. For a moment, the hint of alcohol on his breath and smoke on his clothes was non-existent. "Go out with me." Brooke hadn't realized she had been staring at his lips until she saw them form those four confusing words. She felt her cheeks warm and quickly pulled her eyes upward. "What?" she stuttered. Adrian took a step closer, his gaze steady on hers. His face was serious with a hint of some other emotion Brooke couldn't quite identify. He looked almost curious, like she was a mystery that fascinated him, like he wanted to peel away all of her layers until nothing remained. "I like you," he explained, titling his head enough that the hair on his forehead fell forward, brushing the tops of his dark brows. "I think you should go out with me." Brooke forced air into her lungs, trying to ignore her kicking pulse. "You barely know me. We've met twice before today." "I know you," he said simply. She frowned. He was so difficult to read. An image of the two of them sitting on a bench on this very pier filtered through her mind. She heard the echo of her own voice asking for his name, saw herself leaning into a stranger and feeling that flash of embarrassment when he had abandoned her without a backward glance. Brooke shook her head. Why? She was starting to feel exasperated. The first few times she'd met this boy, he'd wanted as much distance between them as humanly possible, and now he seemed to be forcing his way into her life. "We're different people, Adrian," she tried to explain. He took one more step forward, and they were now close enough that Brooke could see the golden brown hidden in those almost black irises. "I think we're very similar." His low voice sent a shiver down her spine. Brooke couldn't respond. "What would make you say yes?" She opened her mouth and closed it again, realizing he wasn't going to leave with a simple refusal. Considering him for a moment, she finally knew what to say. "I hate smoking." He nodded slowly in consideration, and Brooke felt a sigh of disappointment pass her lips when he took a step away. Why was she disappointed? Wasn't this the result she'd wanted? Brooke watched as he slipped a hand into the front pocket of his jeans, revealing a packet of cigarettes. Hesitantly, her eyes followed his easy stride toward the edge of the pier, watching as Adrian pulled his arm back and tossed the small carton over the ledge so that it disappeared within the dark ocean waves. She didn't say anything as he returned to her side. Her gaze locked on his as he slid something into her hand and gently closed her fingers around the object's smooth edges. "My name is Adrian Bishop," he said, offering her a small piece of himself he'd refused to give her more than 2 years prior, "and I like you, Brooke Rhodes." "This is not the end of our circle." Brooke felt her eyebrows pull together, but Adrian didn't say anything else. He nodded at her once more and fell away in a fashion strangely similar to their first goodbye. She watched his retreating figure until he disappeared entirely in the crowded darkness of the pier. When Brooke looked down at her hands, her eyes latched on the 10 digits that stretched across the metallic surface of the object in her hand. He'd given her his lighter. Minute 4. November 4, 2010. 16:21. "When was the last time you spoke to your dad?" Brooke, having been in the middle of her calculus homework, froze. She watched her already pale skin turn white where it pinched her pen too tightly. Forcing her grip to loosen and her face impassive, she lifted her gaze to where Astrid sat at her desk in their shared room. "HMM," she hummed, pretending she hadn't heard the question. "Have you talked to your dad lately? I know you don't see him often, but I think—" "I called him last week," Brooke lied, cutting her off, and she tried not to flinch when she met Astrid's trusting eyes. She'd spent most of the summer at her roommate's house more than 100 miles from her family, what remained of it. Astrid knew Brooke didn't like to talk about her father, but she also didn't know why. She wasn't one to push Brooke for information on her family situation, which was something Brooke was thankful for. A genuine smile filled Astrid's face, and this time Brooke looked back down at her math assignment. Astrid had always been gullible, so people could lie to her, but she didn't make it easy. "Is he doing okay?" she asked. Brooke nodded, a quick jerk of her chin. "He's doing great. I'm glad." Brooke could hear the smile in her voice, and the guilt of lying to her friend was immediate. "You should go home sometime soon. You must be homesick." Brooke nodded, a tight smile pulling at her lips. Astrid was such a good friend, and she knew she should share more with her, let someone know what had happened with her family, but the idea of saying it out loud was sickening. She didn't want to admit that there wasn't a home for her to miss, that she hadn't seen her family in almost 5 years now. She was distracted by a knock at the door, and Astrid easily pushed herself to her feet, reaching for the handle as she said, "It must be Jer." He said that Astrid suddenly stopped talking when she swung open the door and found an unexpected guest on their doorstep. Brooke didn't miss the way her easy smile became slightly more forced. "What are you doing here?" Brooke asked, standing and walking toward where Adrian stood in his black windbreaker, cheeks flushed from the cold. She stood slightly in front of Astrid and raised both her eyebrows in surprise at the boy in front of her. The last time Brooke had seen Adrian was the end of July, just before she'd returned to school. He lived in a town near Astrid's, so a few times throughout the break, he'd made the short trip to see her. He'd taken her on the date he'd asked for months ago on the pier, and Brooke had continued to say yes every time that followed. "I want to take you somewhere," he said in his usual low tone, ignoring her question. Brooke looked over her shoulder at her friend, who'd abandoned her artificial grin for a more realistic frown. Astrid's dislike of Adrian was well known. "Okay, let's go talk somewhere. Let me just grab my jacket." After sliding her arms into the sleeves of her coat and slipping on a pair of boots, Brooke cast one last look at her roommate before she left with Adrian, who was still waiting patiently just outside their open door. "I'll be back in a couple hours. You and Cher can go to dinner without me," she added with an encouraging smile, but Astrid's expression didn't change. She felt something at her side, and when she looked down, she found Adrian tugging on her hand, sliding his fingers through her own. Brooke shot him a quizzical look but nodded anyway, and she pulled the door shut behind her. "You look good," Brooke told him as they walked down the stairwell and out onto the street below. "I look sober," he said. "You say it like it's a bad thing." "That depends." "On what?" He didn't respond, and their walk continued in a slightly awkward silence. Still, Adrian held Brooke's hand as he led her to wherever he wanted to take her. After a few more turns, Brooke began to recognize the familiar route. "We're going to the pier," she confirmed, glancing up at him. He turned to look at her, dark eyes meeting her bright blue, and he nodded. "What are you doing here?" she asked, repeating her earlier question. She tried to pull her hand from his, but he wouldn't let her, only tightening his grip. "I wanted to see you." He faced forward again and indicated she watched her step as the concrete sidewalk changed to the pier's wooden slats. "You drove 4 hours just so you could see me?" Her tone was disbelieving. Adrian shrugged, but Brooke wasn't satisfied. "We said goodbye, Adrian. You graduated, I'm here, and summer's ended." They'd agreed months ago that whatever weird connection they felt was easier left behind, and she thought he'd agreed. It wasn't like there had been any calls or texts in the months between. Even if there had been, Brooke still felt like she hardly knew him, and she could count the times they'd seen each other since the first meeting on Just Two Hands. The time they'd known one another gave the illusion that there was something substantial, but the space between them was unavoidable. The most she'd learned about him had been shared on a dark bench years ago. Summer hadn't changed that. "I didn't." She looked at him. "What?" He stopped walking and turned to face her completely. "I didn't say goodbye." She furrowed her brows, thinking back to their last time together. Maybe he hadn't said the words, but she'd assumed it was implied. "Oh, well." She trailed off, then weakly offered, "You should have just called." He shook his head. "I don't know what you want me to say." Brooke tried to smile kindly, but she was so confused by his sudden appearance and his constant inability to just talk that he made it difficult. Adrian made everything difficult. "Are you seeing anyone?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers in a hard yet open stare. "Am I seeing anyone?" she repeated, and he nodded patiently. I'm not either," he told her. "I don't want to see anyone but you, Brooke Rhodes, and the idea of you with someone else." His gaze jumped from one of her eyes to the other, unsettled. "It makes me dangerous, Brooke. I want you to be mine as much as I am yours. Adrian, I know you're going to say we don't know each other, but I think you're scared. You like me, too. You know me, too. We are the same type of person, Brooke. I haven't met another living person who understands, but you do." Brooke opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She knew he was talking about her brother, although neither had mentioned him or missing in action since the first night they'd met. It would have been easier to say he was wrong, but Brooke didn't feel like lying again today. "When was the last time you smoked?" she choked out. 7 months, he said evenly. It wasn't hard for her to do the math. He hadn't bought another packet of cigarettes since he'd sent the last one off the edge of this pier for her. "Okay," she said, her voice just an octave above the whisper. Adrian nodded. "Okay," he echoed. They stood there in silence, watching one another, held together by their linked hands. It could have been minutes or maybe hours before she finally spoke again, breaking this fragile moment. "You said you wanted to take me somewhere." Adrian's eyes pulled away from hers, and he looked up. "I want you to embrace your fears." Brooke was confused until she followed his gaze, taking in the large metal structure she hadn't realized they'd stopped beside. The ropes that sectioned off lines and the box for the carnival workers had been packed away for the colder months, leaving nothing but the pier beneath their feet and the immobile Ferris wheel stretching infinitely high into the overcast November sky. "If you're trying to be poetic," Brooke said, resisting when he tried to take a step closer to her worst nightmare, "the metaphor is appreciated, but entirely unnecessary." "I want to climb to the top," he said, managing to tug her half an inch closer. "I'll watch." He shook his head. "You're coming. I'm not going to let you get hurt." "You can't promise that," she said. Adrian's serious expression remained. "I can." He finally let her slip her hand from his, and Brooke squeezed both hands into small fists, flexing her fingers as she took in all the metal and rust and danger just feet in front of her. "I hate heights," she told him, still staring at the enormous wheel. "I know." Taking in a deep breath, Brooke shook out her hands at her sides and finally took a voluntary step forward, bracing her foot on one of the crossing metal beams and reaching high with her right hand, securing herself against the structure. "I'm facing my fears," she mumbled to herself, ignoring the heavy feeling of gravity pushing her back toward the ground. "I'm right behind you," she heard Adrian say as she pushed herself higher, further. Brooke didn't look below, but she knew he was there. She simply watched her hands as they felt for the next cool metal beam, and she realized she wouldn't be doing this for anyone else. As often as she denied it, she did know this boy, and he knew she would always give in to him. Adrian was possibly the only person left in this world that pushed her, had her questioning her morals and testing her own beliefs. She didn't regret this moment, though. She didn't regret him. As she felt his hand supporting her calf, making sure she didn't slip as she climbed another 2 feet, Brooke told herself that it was the dangerous and the ambiguous that define people's lives, and this boy was a deadly twist of both. Taking another deep breath so that it filled her entire chest, she knew that climbing this precarious structure wasn't going to be the moment when she danced the line between living and dying. It was Adrian. He was her near-death experience. Minute 5. May 11, 2011. 12:01. Brooke looked at her reflection and attempted once again to straighten the crooked graduation cap on her head without tangling her hair. When she finally gave up on securing it, the small red and white tassel swung forward in the corner of her vision, brushing the top of her cheek. "Today's the day," Astrid said, appearing in the mirror behind her and squeezing both of Brooke's shoulders. "Are you excited?" Brooke smiled back, turning around to nod at her small blonde friend. She already had a confirmed job at one of the many hospitals she had applied to this past semester, and she was currently looking at apartments in the same area. For the foreseeable future, her life was predictable and steady, two traits Brooke had come to truly value. Still, she was sad to be leaving her friends behind. "I'm excited," she told her. After a moment of consideration, she added honestly, "I'm really going to miss you." Astrid's smile wobbled slightly. "I'm going to miss you, too." She pulled Brooke into a hug, wrapping her arms around the bottom of her rib cage. "I'm just a short plane ride away." Brooke hugged her back and let out a watery laugh. 5 hours isn't short." Her friend pulled away and made sure Brooke was looking at her before she spoke again. "Any distance is short for friends." "I'm always here for you, Brooke." Brooke nodded, forcing herself to smile again, but she knew it didn't reach her eyes. When she felt her phone vibrating at her hip, she pushed aside her graduation robe and slipped herself from the pocket of her dress. "It's Adrian," she said, glancing up at Astrid through her lashes. Brooke still knew she didn't approve for some reason, but lately she'd begun to soften. It was nearly impossible for Astrid to remain hard, especially when something made her friend happy. "I'll meet up with you and Jeremiah in the lobby before the ceremony," she confirmed. Astrid nodded, already pulling out her phone to most likely text her own boyfriend. Brooke said goodbye, and after one last look in the mirror, she left their dorm room for the last time, the small duffel bag with all the things she hadn't yet moved out slung over her shoulder. Brooke emerged from the building, and she found Adrian parked beside the curb, leaning against the passenger side door with his hands in his pockets. He pushed himself into a standing position when he saw her approach, easily taking Brooke's bag from her and tossing it into the trunk of his car. "You look beautiful," he told her seriously, winding an arm around her waist so it settled on the small of her back. He didn't smile, but she'd also realized she smiled enough for the both of them. Plus, whenever he did smile at her, the flash of white teeth felt like a reward, and it made everything he did more important in her eyes. "Thanks," she told him, tilting her head back to look up at him. "Ready to go?" He leaned down and quickly pressed his lips to hers in a chaste kiss. "I am." Adrian opened Brooke's door and then shut it behind her before slipping into the driver's seat and restarting his car. As they drove down the road, she saw him continuously glance toward her from the corner of her eye. After he'd tilted his head in her direction for the 5th time, she turned to him with a smile. "What?" "I did something," he said simply. She rolled her eyes at his always serious tone. "Something good, I hope?" He nodded. "I think so." "Well?" Brooke prompted when he hadn't elaborated. "What did you do?" He looked at her again, his eyes bouncing between her and the road as they drove closer to the venue for her graduation ceremony. "I bought a house." Brooke felt herself do a double take. "You bought a house?" "I put a down payment on a house," he corrected. "It's a 5-minute drive from the hospital." and it's in a safe neighborhood." She paused as she processed this information, and then, a slight smile pulling at her lips, she asked, "Is this your way of asking me to move in with you?" Number. Brooke's smile instantly dropped, and she felt her shoulders stiffen in embarrassment at her assumption. "Oh." Adrian stared at the road for another minute before he finally looked back at her, and Brooke was shocked to see his own smug, closed-lip smile. "I want to live in a 3-bedroom suburban house all alone," he said, his tone giving away nothing, but Brooke was already slapping his arm. "Did you just make a joke?" she said, her laugh the small exhale of her nervous energy. "Is the sky falling? Is that a bird or pig with wings?" She leaned forward in her seat and feigned searching the clear blue sky beyond the roof of the car. His smile melted into one of affection, and he grabbed at the hand she'd used to slap him, enveloping it in his own. Turning into the parking lot, he slowed as a group of robed students crossed the road toward the large building and said, "I'm asking you to move in with me. I requested a job transfer when you first accepted the hospital's offer." "Yes," she said easily, braiding her fingers through his. "Yes, of course." Any fear and disappointment Brooke previously held for leaving this stage of her life behind faded to the back of her mind. She wouldn't be alone. Yes, her friends would be farther than she would have hoped, but she had Adrian. In everything he'd done the past year, he'd proven that she always would have him. "Good," he said, still smiling. Adrian parked and gestured to the floor at her feet with a tilt of his head as he turned off the engine. "My wallet fell earlier. Can you grab it for me?" Brooke nodded, leaning down to pick up the worn leather wallet. As she was straightening in her seat, she noticed something had fallen from one of the folds. Picking it up, she turned it around, her breath catching in her throat when she realized what she'd found. Adrian had opened his door to exit the car, but he turned back when he noticed Brooke hadn't moved. His gaze instantly dropped to the photo in her hands, and Brooke could have sworn his eyes darkened a shade. It looked like his pupils had swallowed both irises whole. It was a photo of a young girl, maybe 16, her dark hair cropped to her shoulders. She was leaning against a low wooden fence and her mouth was open mid-laugh, a hand lifted to brush her wind-blown hair from her eyes. Even half obscured, Brooke noticed their color in the photo, its slight graininess indicating its age. She had to admit, the similarities were uncanny. "This is her," she exhaled, not lifting her eyes. He'd still never talked about her since that first night on the pier. From the corner of her eye, she saw Adrian move his head in what she guessed was a silent nod. Flipping over the picture, she realized something had been written on the back, but repeated handling had erased whatever words had been there. "What did it say?" Brooke's voice was a whisper as she ran her fingers over the faded ink, feeling the indentations in the picture's surface. "Now I'm always with you," he said, his voice rough. After a reluctant beat, he added, "Love, missing in action." Brooke cleared her throat, finally looking up. "She's beautiful." She visibly flinched after realizing how vain she sounded. They both remembered what he'd once told her, "You look so much like her." She was. He watched Brooke with that steady expression, and she wished he weren't so comfortable with silence because she was afraid to say anything else. After another moment of studying her, however, Adrian spoke again. "You are everything to me, Brooke Rhodes." "I know," he coughed. "I know she's gone now." Brooke let her eyes drop back to missing in action's smiling face. "I didn't realize how much she—" "No," he cut her off, realizing what she was about to ask him. "My feelings for you have nothing to do with her." Brooke furrowed her brows, her gaze dancing from the girl in her hands to the boy in front of her. It was hard to believe he couldn't be reminded of his past and didn't see Brooke beneath her look-alike exterior. Extending her arm, she offered the photograph to him and he took it from her. "Okay," she said, dropping her hands to her lap. "I should probably go inside and catch Esther and Jeremiah before the ceremony. I'll find you afterward." Looking up for the picture, he nodded. He finally slid from the driver's seat and managed to round the car and open the door for Brooke before she did it herself. Thanking him, she stood there for a just breath, gaze jumping from his hand to his face. When he didn't say anything else, she let out a small sigh, slightly disappointed. "Okay," she repeated, and she turned on her heel and headed into the large lobby for the ceremony. The space was flooded with students, all a mix of red and white as they moved about the space, taking pictures with friends and family before they headed through the doors of the large auditorium. "Rhodes." Brooke felt someone place a hand on one of her shoulders, and when she looked up, she found Jeremiah smiling down at her. His smile was uneven, offset by a single dimple, but it still made Brooke smile back. "Hey, Jer. Where's Esther?" He shrugged. "She's taking pictures with a couple of friends from her classes." Brooke smiled kindly. "You ready for the big move? When will you register for classes?" Jeremiah was going to graduate school across the country and Astrid was going with him, hoping to start applying for jobs once she arrived. "Sometime next month. It'll be an adjustment, but I'm ready for something new, you know. Plus, I'll be fine with her tagging along. I'm sure she'll take good care of me," he joked, rolling his eyes at Astrid's mother hen tendencies. Still, another smile pulled at his lips, and she couldn't help but melt. Brooke didn't think she'd ever seen someone's life so intertwined with that of someone else. Jeremiah's world revolved around Astrid, and Brooke knew he would take care of her just as much as she would him. "I'm sure she will," Brooke agreed. Someone announced that all students had to leave the lobby and prepare to walk, and after Astrid ran over to give her one last hug, Brooke joined the crowd of people being funneled toward their seats in the center section of the auditorium. Everything afterward passed by quickly. She rose with the rest of her row when it was their turn to be ushered toward the stage, and she was so focused on not tripping on her robe that she hardly heard her name called. Beyond the stage lights, everything else in the auditorium was an indistinguishable shadow. She tried to smile and shook the hands of the university president and other faculty as she made her way across the stage, finally accepting her diploma and returning to her seat. Once everyone had walked and the president announced the class of 2011 graduated, shouts filled the auditorium and multiple students around her tossed their hats into the air, others turning to their friends with tear-filled eyes as they hugged tightly. Brooke tried to search for Astrid or Jeremiah, but it was impossible in this crowd of people. Her gaze continued to sweep her peers as everyone surged toward the exits. Brooke stood just outside the doors, squinting against the light as everyone spilled onto the lawn outside. She hoped Adrian could see her from her vantage point, and she smiled at the few familiar faces that passed her. Having just recognized and hugged someone from one of her last semester labs, Brooke's smile was still firmly in place when she heard someone clear his throat behind her. She expected to find Adrian or maybe even Jeremiah standing there, but the sight of the person in front of her caused all the blood to drain from her face. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, taking in his ill-fitted grey suit and hollow cheeks. His hair had thinned considerably since she'd last seen him, and he looked like he'd lost weight, but he still smelled like ash. Brooke could have choked on the scent. She couldn't believe after everything that had happened he would still have the nerve to pick up a lighter. "It's your graduation, Brookie." She flinched at the nickname. "I wasn't going to miss my daughter's graduation." She recoiled when he reached for her elbow. "I didn't invite you." Her father's hand dropped, and the folds in his forehead deepened. "Have you been getting my letters?" "You never responded, so I thought maybe." "I got them." "Oh." He frowned again. "I know what I did was wrong, and nothing I do will ever be enough punishment for what happened that night. I will go to my grave regretting it, Brookie." "Good." Her tone was clipped. Brooke wrapped her arms around her waist and tried not to shiver, as affected by her own coldness as he was. He took a step forward, and she took a step back. "I don't know how else to apologize. It destroys me knowing." "No," Brooke said, cutting him off. She felt tears burn her eyes, and she hated that he was ruining today for her. The last time she'd seen her father, he was sitting on the curb in front of their house, a police officer standing in front of him as paramedics carried 2 body bags from what was left of their home. "It destroys me." "You destroyed them." Another gasp. "Brookie." Her father trailed off, his blue eyes catching on something over her shoulder. Suddenly someone was standing between Brooke and her father like a human shield. When she looked up, she realized he had his back to her father so that he faced her completely. "What's wrong?" Adrian asked, lifting a hand to cradle her cheek but, upon noticing the look on her face, dropped it immediately. She was wide-eyed and choked gasps and so many emotions that she didn't know how to respond. Adrian barely glanced at her father, but the small look he offered was almost deadly. "Leave now," he said, turning back to Brooke and taking her elbow to guide her away from her father and all these people. She hadn't realized before, but she was one small person drowning in a sea of red and white. Her father started to protest. "Who do you think?" Brooke didn't hear the end of his sentence because Adrian had effectively pushed them through the crowd, finally finding an abandoned area along the side of the building. He dropped his hand and stood watching her as she attempted to control her breathing. "That was your father?" he asked. She forced herself to nod. "I think pass out." Adrian's hands twitched at his sides. "You won't? You don't have to talk anymore. Breathe with me, okay? And out. Come on, Brooke," he added when her breathing still stuttered. "Just breathe. In, out, in, out, 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 in." She wasn't doing this right. Brooke ignored his initial suggestion, and tried to tell him what she hadn't told anyone in years. Maybe if she got it out, her heart would slow and her breathing even. "I never." The SOB escaped her throat, and she clamped a hand over her mouth to stop another. She couldn't breathe, and she felt like she was going to die from not having enough air at this point. The thought only made her more panicked. Before she could realize what was happening, Brooke was surrounded by Adrian, his arms, his chest, his scent, and everything else him. She focused on the pressure of his body against hers and tried to match her breaths to his in order to slow her racing heart. In, out, in, out. Brooke listened to the beat of his heart, finally finding something steady and reassuring to ground her. Her heart slowed, her breaths grew less shallow. "Okay," he whispered against the crown of her head. "You're okay?" Brooke nodded her head against his body, and then she breathed into his beating chest. "My father, not my family. I don't have a family." Adrian only squeezed her harder, pulled her in closer if that were even possible. "I'll be your family," he promised her. "I am your family." Item number 009. Case No. D327HL. Item number 009. A page from Brooke Rhodes Bishop's Journal, dated July 26, 2015. Apparently, once you reach a certain age and begin to approach your last years, you start to reflect on your life, and that subsequently becomes your life. You're reduced to remembering the younger, happier mirror image of yourself. At least, that's what I recall learning in my introductory psychology course in college. What you're not told is how every year, you'll feel lonelier. The people in your life are transient, and the ones that are constant aren't always present not in the ways you wish they were. I feel like I have no one that could help me. Everyone I love is either thousands of miles away or 10 feet underground, and I'm utterly abandoned on this sinking ship. It's like this. When the water continues rising and the waves keep crashing, oxygen can no longer reach your brain. You've been underwater far too long. You stop thinking properly, and you can't comprehend things clearly. So, your brain is so oxygen deprived that you'll grasp for anything that could possibly save your life. My problem was that I didn't clutch a life jacket. I grabbed an anchor. In all honesty, to breathe air at this point would burn more than the feeling of letting myself sink further, deeper, darker. Time to broken down, time to far gone, and I'm too alone. Minute 6. Trigger warning for most chapters from here on out. January 18, 2012. 0 minutes and 3 seconds. Brooke hadn't lived in an actual house since her childhood home burned down halfway through her junior year of high school, taking the mother and 15-year-old boy with it. Her father had always had a bad habit of smoking indoors during the colder months. He had an even worse habit of missing the ashtray. 7 years later, the house Brooke sat in now was different. It was newer and comfortably fit the two people that lived there. The carpet didn't have a stain from a spilled orange soda hidden under an end table, and the couch didn't have a hole chewed through its right cushion from the time Henry had offered to watch his friend's dog. But this house also didn't have the video games of a teenage boy piled next to the television stand, and it wasn't constantly filled with dirty sports equipment and sibling rivalry and laughter over the kitchen table. This house was silent. Brooke was perched on a kitchen bar stool, staring at a computer screen she wasn't really reading. The only animation on screen that drew her eye was the continuous changing of the clock as time grew older. Adrian had gotten off work at 7, more than 5 hours ago. She suddenly straightened in her seat when she heard the sound of a lock turning, followed by the clink of keys hitting the ceramic bowl near the door. Each beat of Brooke's heart matched his footsteps as he walked closer. Adrian finally appeared in the living room and tossed his jacket across the back of the couch. When he turned around to face the kitchen, Brooke caught the surprise that flashed across his features for half of a second before that impassive curtain fell again. "You're awake," he said, stating the obvious. "I am." Brooke rose from her seat and pulled her brows together. "Where were you? I tried calling you at least 10 times." Her worry was clear in her voice, but so was her hesitance to believe whatever he told her. The low lighting in the room sent disconcerting shadows across Adrian's face, so she couldn't see his eyes. Everything about him right now was dark, darker. "I went out with some guys from work," he said evenly. loosening the tie at his throat and popping the top few buttons of his shirt. Brooke took another step closer and tried to catch his eyes, but it was nearly impossible. "Was Ryland there?" Brooke asked, already knowing the answer. It was a test, but she wished so badly that he wouldn't fail. "Don't like to meet," she begged. "Please don't like." Adrian gave her a curt nod, and she had to stop herself from flinching. "He bought everyone drinks." "Adrian," Brooke whispered. She took that last step so that they were only a foot apart. His eyes lifted from where they'd been locked somewhere on the space between them, and they finally met hers. "Where were you?" "I already told you," he said through gritted teeth, his voice low. "I called Ryland after you didn't pick up the first few times, and he said you clocked out early. Just tell me where you went. Tell me the truth." She reached for his arm but he brushed her off, taking a step back. They studied one another in silence, and Brooke wondered which of them would break the wall, start the flood. "Let's go to bed. It's late." He tried to shrug past this conversation, but Brooke wasn't going to let him. She was comfortable with the quiet, but absolute silence was more than she could handle. If they were to move forward, he had to talk to her. She grabbed for him, and this time he let her wrap her fingers around his elbow. He looked at her over his shoulder and their gazes locked. Where she swallowed around the lump in her throat. "Were you with someone?" Adrian recoiled, and Brooke could clearly read the emotion etched into every line on his face. He was hurt and he was insulted. "You think I would cheat on you?" he spat. "After everything we shared, you think I would do something like that to you to us?" Both her hands fell to her sides. Her voice was a surprised exhale and she shrugged. "I don't know what I should think. Sometimes you disappear for hours, and you won't pick up your phone." "I would never," he seethed, leaning toward her so that the light caught his eyes. They were obsidian. Brooke's mouth dropped open, and her voice died in her throat. She was almost too afraid to speak. "You want to know where I was?" he asked, his breath fanning across Brooke's cheekbones. This close, she could smell the alcohol on his breath, and her body's response was immediate. The sudden rush of adrenaline in her bloodstream made her dizzy. "I was at her fucking grave," Adrian said, and his voice was absolutely dangerous. "Sometimes I'll go to her grave because the first girl I ever loved tied a noose around her neck when I was 19. I left her because I thought school was more important than her, and now she's gone." He leaned away from Brooke, the action concealing his face in shadows once again. His tone was dripping in sarcasm when he said, "So, please forgive me if I don't answer some of your calls." Brooke couldn't stop herself from gasping. "Adrian, I didn't." "You should," he said, leveling his gaze with hers. "You should know. I'm going to sleep in the guest room tonight. I'm upset, and I don't feel like talking anymore." He turned to leave, but Brooke reached out again to stop him. "Wait, Adrian, you shouldn't just..." Before she could finish what she'd been about to say, Adrian quickly reacted to her trying to grab his arm, pushing her away from him. The force of his shove sent her flying backward, and her body arched against the sofa table behind their couch. One of the lamps toppled to the floor, and Brooke dragged the glass dish to the ground when she clutched at the table in a fruitless attempt to stay upright. The crystal shards shattered around her like a sparkling mosaic, and she felt a sharp pain in her palm. Using her uninjured hand, Brooke clutched her bleeding hand by the wrist and looked up at Adrian with wide, scared eyes. For the first time in all the years she'd known him, his expression matched hers. "Brooke," he gasped, falling to his knees in front of her. When he moved closer, Brooke scrambled away like a wounded animal, pedaling her feet in order to create as much distance between them as possible. She sucked in a deep breath, then shook her head. "Stay away from me," she whispered. He flinched and tried to move closer to her again. He was clearly hurt by her words, and for half a heartbeat Brooke was sympathetic. Then the pain shooting through her hand registered, and it somewhat cleared her clouded thoughts. "I didn't, Brooke. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, please forgive me." He started crying. "I love you more than I love myself, Brooke. I will do anything to make sure you're in my life." By an honest SOB racked his entire body. "I don't want to lose you, too. I can't. I'm so sorry." Blood streamed down her forearm, and tears streamed down his face, and Brooke questioned her instincts. Instinct told her to run, to flee, to start swimming toward the surface before she ran out of air. Still, she paused. It's always the pause that leads to mistake. She looked at him, showing more emotion than he'd ever offered, and doubt slowly crept through her system. "It was an accident." Adrian nodded his tear-streaked face and moved toward her. She didn't push away. "It was. I would never hurt you, Brooke Rhodes. Never intentionally." "You wouldn't," she agreed. She watched him for a second, still hesitant, and then she heard his voice in her head. "I want you to embrace your fears." So, instead of running away, Brooke did the very thing her mind begged her not to. She crawled across the glass-littered floor, and she embraced him. Minute 7. June 31, 2012. 13:32. Astrid was getting married. She had always wanted a beach wedding, but it rained the day she finally walked down the aisle. It's not like the weather mattered, though, because Simon was Catholic, so she said her vows in front of a large mosaic of the Christian Savior. Brooke stood beside her best friend, and she watched her recite in front of her friends and family what the two had written and rewritten a dozen times in the past week. She looked radiant in her form-fitting blush dress, and everything about her today glowed. Scanning the crowd, she found Adrian a few rows back from the front, and when he caught her gaze, he tilted his head just slightly in a sign of acknowledgement. Brooke smiled back at him in return and continued searching the congregation for any other familiar faces as Simon began his own marital promises. When her eyes reached the very last pews of the church, however, Brooke paused. A lanky form in a crumpled suit was slumped in the far back, and Brooke barely concealed her surprise as she forced her gaze back to the bridal party. The priest had just permitted the groom to kiss the bride, and Simon snaked one arm around Astrid's waist, tipping her back in an exaggerated dip as he kissed her. Brooke saw her friend smile against his lips. She saw her happy. After the newly wedded couple danced their way back up the aisle, the attendees slowly filed out of their pews, dutifully following to see the bride and groom off to the limo that would take them to the reception hall. Brooke fell back, feigning preoccupation with the bouquets that the party had left behind. Looking up from a bundle of light pink roses that she'd gathered, Brooke realized the church was nearly empty. Adrian must have left with the rest of the congregation, assuming he'd reconnect with her at the reception. Still, one figure at the back of the church remained. Dropping the bouquet to her side, Brooke slowly traced the path Astrid had made down the aisle. The tulle skirt of the overdramatic bridesmaid dress her friend had selected bounced with every step. He didn't look up when she slowly lowered herself onto the pew beside him, setting the flowers to one side and leaving a small gap between them on the other. "Why did you come?" she asked softly, her gaze drifting around the expansive church. It seemed even larger now that it was empty. When she chanced looking beside her, she found forest green eyes filled with anger and misery and an entire war of emotions. Jeremiah dropped his head to his hands, bracing an elbow on each knee and tangling long fingers through his chestnut hair. "I just wanted to see her," he choked, running his hands from his hair to his face. He pulled them away and his eyes were red, his mouth twisted. Brooke smiled sympathetically. It was almost physically painful seeing one of her friends so torn over the happiness of another. "You should have called her. Maybe ... I don't know. Maybe it would have helped you both." Jeremiah was already shaking his head before she'd finished talking. "It all happened so fast," he said, turning in the pew so he faced Brooke completely, "but it could have taken 10 years, and I still wouldn't have been able to put it into words, put her into words. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I made her doubt herself." Brooke twisted her fingers in the folds of her skirt, unable to meet his eyes for a moment. His words held so much sincerity and raw honesty and the absolutely heartbreaking kind of love that it hurt her stomach. She looked up through her lashes, and his eyes were still locked on hers. "You're the best kind of person, Jeremiah Brady," she told him. His lips twitched in the sign of a weak smile. "You are, too, Rhodes." Brooke smiled disbelievingly, and she shrugged, looking down at her hands. "You are," he insisted, bumping her shoulder with his and forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're analyzing me like I'm one of your characters," she accused. "I spent thousands of dollars on a master's in English. I have to analyze something." This time his slight smile stayed. They fell into an easy silence as they sat on that last pew, isolated in their own world and immune to the wedding and the storm and everything else outside this singular moment. "Chair," Brooke finally said, glancing at him out of the corner of her eye. He hummed to show he was listening. "I have an English question." He turned to look at her and nodded for her to continue. "Do you think stories can ever correct mistakes made at the beginning? Can the characters be redeveloped?" Jeremiah raised a brow and twisted his lips in thought for a moment, considering what she'd asked. "I think it's possible for the characters to change," he finally said, "but the ending is set. There's a certain point where the small changes in plot don't really make a difference anymore. It's too late to..." He trailed off, searching for the right words to finish his thought. "Too late to start swimming toward the surface," Brooke supplied, her tone flat. He nodded. Brooke's smile was forced when she asked, "Will you walk with me to the reception?" "It's not far." Jeremiah agreed, and when they pushed open the church doors, it was no longer raining. For just that small period of time, the sky was clear. Hands shoved in his pockets and fingers playing with the material of her skirt, they walked side by side the entire time, simply soaking in the newly arrived sun, neither speaking until they stood in front of the venue for the reception hall. Brooke could hear music spilled from within, hundreds of voices twisting together to form a low, indecipherable rumble. Brooke stopped to face her friend, tilting her head back to look at him and squinting against the light. "You'll be okay, Chair. Maybe not right now, but your story has a good ending," she told him seriously, echoing their earlier conversation. "You deserve a good ending, too, Rhodes." Brooke shrugged, cutting her gaze to the side. "Maybe. She saw him frown out of the corner of her eye, so she looked at him again. "Jeremiah," she said softly, and he worked the brow, that frown still playing at his lips. "I'm going to kiss you now." Jeremiah looked startled, his mouth parting slightly in confusion, but he didn't pull away when Brooke moved closer, pushing herself up on her toes so they were eye level. Faces mere inches apart, she watched his dark green eyes flutter shut and felt the small exhale of his breath against her lips. As Brooke tilted her head toward Jeremiah's and kissed her friend, she was granted a small gasp of oxygen. She still wasn't certain if her lungs were filling, and maybe her body was sinking, but standing here with this heartbroken boy, she was given a small moment of reprieve. Brooke kissed him until she felt small droplets of rain beginning to trace down her exposed shoulders. She pulled away, her hands resting on his arms, and his eyes were still closed. They didn't open until raindrops lightly tapped his eyelids, falling down his cheeks like tears. "I meant what I said," she told him. Slowly, he shook his head. "I know." Brooke lowered herself so she was no longer on her toes, and she pushed open the doors to the reception hall. When she glanced back one last time, she caught a glimpse of Jeremiah smiling, all blinding white, gapped front teeth visible, and that single dimple defined in his cheek. The door slammed shut, cutting off her view of one of her last friends. When Brooke weaved through the crowd, she found Simon and Astrid in the middle of the dance's floater, the lights low as she rested her head on his shoulder and swayed to the slow beat of their first dance. She felt someone sidle up behind her, and Adrian braided his fingers through hers, squeezing her hand once. He leaned down to whisper to her, and when he spoke, his lips brushed the shell of her ear. "I like this." Brooke nodded. "I do, too," she said, watching as Simon spun Astrid, and she laughed at his attempt of twirling her with the train of her dress. "She looks happy." "We should get married," she heard him say. Brooke turned to him, a laugh ready on her lips, but she found Adrian's usually straight expression when her eyes met his. "You're quick enough to propose at a wedding?" she teased, waiting for him to crack a rare smile. He shook his head. "We can get rings, go to City Hall, and use the money we saved on a wedding for a trip." He picked up her other hand so their two bodies formed a small circle, unbreakable with his grip. "I told you I would be your family, Brooke Rhodes, and I'm going to keep my promise. Will you marry me?" Brooke let out a disbelieving laugh. She never knew what to expect with Adrian, and now was no exception. "You won't be able to call me Brooke Rhodes if we get married," she finally said. He smiled. "I think we can work something out." He squeezed her hands. "Is that a yes?" Brooke didn't know why, but she thought back to her conversation with Jeremiah. She recalled the hundreds of books she'd read over the years, all the flat characters with happily ever afters and every perfect ending with no loose ends. Real stories, without fake faults and flaws, cracks and breaks. There's nothing wrong with the imperfections, as long as she could control them. Brooke felt she knew her limits. She understood that it was the ripped edges and the folded corners that make people human. Still, what if your character flaw was another human being? Meeting Adrian's dark eyes, Brooke nodded. She said, "Yes." Minute 8. April 18, 2013. 18:04. Cradling her phone against her shoulder, Brooke leaned closer to the mirror in her bathroom, the edge of the counter cutting into her stomach. She winced as she dabbed antiseptic on the cut above her eyebrow, blaming herself for having picked at the scab too soon. She'd hoped the skin beneath would have been healed enough that she could avoid the curious glances she'd been getting at the hospital this past week, but now her forehead was bleeding again. Sighing, she realized it would probably scar. "I went on a date," Jeremiah told her from the other end of the phone. Securing one of the clear band-aids to her skin, Brooke stepped away from the sink and refocused her attention on the conversation. Every week, like clockwork, Jeremiah had called her. Even though he was thousands of miles away, Brooke valued the consistency of something reliable like her friend calling her to simply talk. She smiled. "You go on a date every week, Jer." This one was different. Brooke imagined him shrugging. "I don't know how to describe it. I didn't think about her once, and usually she's my comparison, you know." They both knew who he was talking about. "No, not really," Brooke said honestly, dropping into an armchair in hers and Adrian's bedroom and curling her feet beneath her. "I've never had anyone to compare. Adrian's the only person I've ever loved." After a beat, she added, "Like that, I mean." Jeremiah did his version of a laugh, which was just a harsh exhale through his nose distorted by static over the phone. "Consider yourself lucky, then." Brooke absently lifted a hand to the cut over her brow. "I guess I am." "Hey, Jer." "Yeah? I'm glad things are different for you. You sound happy." It was silent as her words were absorbed over the line, and for a moment it was like she was shouting into the miles between them. Sure, these conversations gave the illusion that she wasn't entirely alone, but distance was still distance. Hearing someone's voice was nothing when compared to having her friend beside her, physically present. "I'll always love Astrid," Jeremiah finally said, and his voice wasn't a whisper, but it was significantly quieter. "I realize now, though, that we weren't the best fit. She was always larger than life, you know. I don't know if I was enough for her, which isn't a bad thing. She filled the entire room, and I think she needed someone who was just more. I want someone who just is, who's comfortable being what they are, comfortable being enough." Brooke emitted a breathy laugh. "You make everything sound like a monologue. It's almost like you should be writing a book or something," she joked. Jeremiah taught high school English while he worked on his Ph.D., but for the past couple months, he'd been sending her the beginnings of a novel he'd been working on. She could hear his smile through the phone. "Almost. In all honesty, though, I think you and I could have been good together. If you didn't love Adrian and if I wasn't with Astrid back then, you and I could have been happy, don't you think?" Brooke didn't miss the underlying message in what he was saying. "You are enough." She felt like crying, but she willed her eyes to stay dry. "Yeah, Jer. I think we could have been happy." She knew he wouldn't take her words the wrong way. Jeremiah was a good friend and she was comfortable having this conversation with him. It was innocent curiosity, mere speculation. "You really love him?" Brooke coughed to clear her throat. "Yeah," she whispered, forcing a smile even though she knew he couldn't see it. "I really do." She heard noise on the other end of the line and then the shuffling of fabric like someone had moved to cover the speaker. A second later, Jeremiah said, "I have to go." Apparently one of the chaperones for tonight's dance showed up drunk, and they need a replacement. "I hated high school the first time. Why did I come back?" Brooke laughed. "This is what I get for grading papers in my classroom instead of leaving while I had the chance. I'll call you next week, whatever the hell your name is now." "Rhodes Bishop," Brooke said, bringing up a hand to cover her smile. "There's a hyphen." and they say writers are pretentious." Brooke bit the skin beside her thumbnail, still smiling. "I'll talk to you soon, Chair. Bye, Rhodes." He finally hung up, and Brooke didn't miss the way he only said her maiden name. For some reason, it didn't bother her. Who was that? Brooke realized she'd been smiling down at the now black screen of her phone, and her head snapped up so suddenly that it hurt her neck. Adrian stood in the doorway of their bedroom, still dressed for work, although his tie had been long abandoned. When her gaze drifted down, she noticed he had a bottle dangling from one of his hands, and she couldn't hide her flinch. It was an ugly reminder that his sobriety at the beginning of their relationship had since been deserted. "I was just talking to Jeremiah," she said with a shrug, trying to seem nonchalant. It was always difficult to tell how he would react when he was like this. She didn't know how much he'd been drinking, how long. These first few minutes were always like dancing across a minefield. Adrian's face was as impassive as ever. Brooke could never read him until it was too late to react. "You talk to him a lot." Brooke slowly stood from the chair and set her phone on the nearby dresser, taking a step toward him. "He's my friend." "Is that all?" Lifting the bottle, Adrian took a long pull of alcohol, the clear liquid sloshing at the midway point. She stood in front of him now and gently placed a hand on the one he was using to support the bottle. His dark gaze cut between her hand and her eyes. "Don't like to meet, Brooke." "I'm not," she promised, willing him to see her beyond the haze in his mind. Suddenly, she was pushed back a couple steps, and Adrian dropped the bottle, his other hand still raised after he'd shoved her. The crash was deafening in the silence of their home, and glass filled the space between them, a sharp, sparking river. "I said," Adrian seethed, each word punctuated by a step toward her, his shoes crunching against the broken shards. "Don't fucking like to meet, Brooke." "Adrian," she squeaked when he finally reached her, placing the hand on each of her arms and holding her so tightly bruises must already be forming. "I love you, don't I tell you that enough? I love you more than anyone. Why would you cheat on me?" He shook her. "Why? Do I not tell you enough? Do I not show you enough?" He started to pull her toward the bed, and Brooke tried to resist, but it only caused her bare feet to scrape against the glass-filled floor. She felt the warm blood beginning to slide across the soles of her feet. "Adrian, please. I'm not lying. You're drunk. Let me clean up the mess so." "That's all you do, isn't it, little girl? You clean up my messes so that I don't have to. Why do you always hold that against me? That's why you left, isn't it? You're trying to punish me. You want me to know how much it hurt when I left, so you're returning the favor." He was so drunk that his words were beginning to slur, and Brooke had no idea what he was talking about. He was delirious, incoherent. "I never left, Adrian. I'm right here," she said, trying to soothe him. Her feet hurt, and her head was starting to throb again. "Please." The words died on her lips when his gaze finally cut back to hers, and it was absolutely terrifying. The look in his eyes was frenzy. She knew the wild idea had forced its way through his drunken delirium, and Brooke felt like her entire body had just been doused in ice water. "No, Adrian. Listen to me, just." Adrian threw her onto their bed so hard that Brooke's head bounced against the headboard, jarring her skull. She was dizzy, blinking frantically in an attempt to clear the black spots from her vision. Adrian kneeled in front of her, messily pulling off his suit jacket and unbuttoning the rest of his shirt. I need to show you how much I love you. I thought you knew when I asked you to marry me, but I must not have told you enough. I need to show you." "No," she said. "Please, no. I don't want this, Adrian." Again and again she repeated that word, whispered his name as a plea, but he was inconsolable. As he pushed her farther into their bed, as he showed her how much he supposedly loved her, Brooke heard him whisper her name, not Brooke's name, but hers. "I love you," he told her, and tears began to stream down Brooke's face and across her cheeks, soaking into the comforter beneath her. She tried to focus on something else, anything else, and her eyes fell on their bedroom window. She watched the sun beyond it, imagined its warmth on her skin, imagined a world where this wasn't happening to her. She felt so betrayed, so angry, so frustrated. She felt like she was dying. But, what does someone do when she loves the person holding the gun? Minutes, hours, days, entire lifetimes passed. The sun rose, and it set, and Brooke didn't think she would make it through the night to see it rise again. Finally, it stopped, and Adrian fell asleep, but Brooke didn't move. She couldn't do anything. Every sensation felt numbed. Hours later, when Adrian finally awoke sober, he found her sitting on the edge of their bed, still staring out the window. Moving this far had felt like the greatest feat of her life. "Brooke." His voice was thick from sleep. "You called me missing in action last night," she said, not turning around. Her voice was raw, so she couldn't manage anything above the broken whisper. She couldn't say the words. She couldn't even believe them. She heard him push the sheets aside, and as he rounded the bed to stand in front of her, he took in the glass, the blood, the crime scene he'd left behind the night before. When he dropped to his knees in front of her, blocking her view of the sun, his face was distraught. "Brooke, I'm sorry. You know I don't mean it." She knew better than anyone how much he didn't mean it. He never meant it any time he accidentally hurt her. "I'm not her, Adrian. I never will be her." Her voice was flat, her gaze unfocused. "Brooke." She felt his agony. She'd never heard a more genuine, heartbroken apology than this man sitting before the woman he loved, whispering her name like the word burned his throat. "What do you want?" he asked. "I'll do anything you want. I'll do anything for you, Brooke. Please, just tell me what I need to do. I want—" She trailed off, unsure what exactly she should say. There were so many possible ends to that sentence. "I want a divorce. I want you to love me less. I want to end the heartache. I want the strength to give you up. I want to stop the fights. I want to stop the pain. I want it all to stop." But most of all, she wanted him. Beneath the shattered bottles and bruised knuckles was the man she still desperately loved. Was he worth the pain, though? Maybe this was simply a consequence of getting to be with the man she loved, the man she'd loved more than any other person before him. This was the one person left who loved her more fully and absolutely than anyone ever had. With a painful thump of her heart, Brooke felt he was worth the cuts and the bruises. He was worth the blood spilled and tears shed. He didn't mean to hurt her, she knew he didn't. He just loved in the most painful, most desperate way possible. That was how he loved her. That was how he loved everyone, like he was drowning, and they were air. Brooke was too exhausted to lie, to resist, so she told him the truth. "I want you." He nodded and pulled her into his arms, stroking her hair, soothing the throbbing pain he'd caused when he'd thrown her against the headboard. "I want you, too, "You're all I've ever wanted," he said softly. She felt more than heard the shudder in his chest when he took a deep breath. "You are my new beginning, Brooke Rhodes. And you," she thought, "are my tragic end." Item number 011. Case No. D327HL. Item number 011. Found August 3, 2015 in the Bishop's kitchen. Description: the photograph taken on scene shows blood spots on the tile floor in the Bishop's kitchen. It is estimated the blood is at least a week old. Samples have been sent to the lab, but it is highly probable the blood belongs to Rhodes Bishop. Minute 9. June 9, 2015. 9:16. When she first started doing it, Brooke hadn't realized what she'd been preparing. Every time a new bruise bloomed on her arm, she'd tuck a favorite blouse or pair of shoes in the trunk of her car. One time, after he'd punched her so hard that it punctured the skin of her collarbone, Brooke forced a bag of toiletries under the passenger seat. The red outline of a hand on her cheek always led to socks in the glove compartment. Brooke was running out of socks. Now, as she stood at the rain-splattered dining room window that overlooked the street, watching as her husband's car turned left off their road and disappeared behind a patch of trees, Brooke knew exactly what she was doing. As soon as that silver sedan was out of sight, she was running. Her bare feet slapped on each step as she took them two at a time, throwing open the door to their shared bedroom. Brooke easily pulled her suitcase from its place beneath the bed and began haphazardly piling in all the clothing she hadn't already hidden in her car. She needed to move as fast as possible because she was afraid she would second-guess what she was doing. Jeremiah always mentioned that she should visit him, and Brooke couldn't count the number of times she'd absently looked up the many routes across country. If she drove straight, it could take her less than 2 days. Brooke knew she would be too on edge to sleep along the way, anyway. Jeremiah didn't know she was coming, but she had miles upon miles to call him and let him know. She knew he wouldn't be upset. She could show up on his doorstep with her bags and no ticket home, and he'd roll his eyes, step aside, and make her dinner. It's not like he'd be mad enough to hit her. Brooke tossed in one last mound of clothing and zipped her suitcase shut. Before she slid the bag to the floor, she crossed the room to the dresser where she kept her mother's jewelry in a tiny wooden box, the corners charred. When she lifted the silver clasp and opened the small chest to make sure everything she needed was there, she froze. Since she was 16, Brooke had always worn her mother's wedding ring on a thin gold chain around her neck, but it had also been one of the first things hidden in the trunk of her car. Now, however, the sparkling gem was positioned perfectly in the center of the box, its chain not tangled in the slightest. Her heart stopped beating, and Brooke could not force air into her lungs. Brooke. For one silent heartbeat, Brooke remembered something from her past. When she was younger, her parents would rent the same beach house every July. She always looked forward to those couple of weeks when she and Henry would beg either parent to go with them to the beach, and both would spend all day splashing in the salty ocean water and building mediocre sand castles that they thought looked like elaborate kingdoms. Her mother always warned her not to go in the water past her chest, but Brooke remembered pushing just a little farther each time she went out, curiously peeping over her shoulder to make sure her mother wasn't watching her break their only rule at the beach. One time, her mother noticed, but Brooke couldn't hear her shouted warnings of the large wave rising behind her. Brooke had gone too far, and when the sounds of waves are roaring in someone's ears, it's hard to hear anything else. In the present, Brooke imagined the sound of a key turning the lock as her feet pounded up the stairs. She thought about his footsteps concealed beneath the bang of their bedroom door against the wall. "Brooke," Adrian repeated, and she didn't want to turn around because she knew the horror would be blatantly clear on her face. "Look at me." Grasping her mother's ring so that it would surely leave a round imprint in her palm, Brooke forced herself to turn around and face this terrible nightmare. Adrian was still wearing the business suit she'd seen him leave in this morning, and he casually leaned against the doorway to their bedroom. Brooke realized that he knew he wasn't really going to work this morning. He'd probably called in sick already. The ring in her jewelry box made that clear. He was playing games with her. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. Taking a step forward, he nudged a piece of her clothing that had missed the suitcase, daring her to deny the obvious. Brooke tried to take a steadying breath of air, but it caught in her throat. She felt like she couldn't breathe. The walls were slowly moving closer, and she knew she needed to get out. Do something. Do anything. Now was her only chance. She wanted to take 10 steps away from him until her back was flush against the wall, but she forced herself to move closer instead. Every question she asked in return was punctuated by the sound of her feet against the polished wooden floor. "Why are you home?" She counted down one step. "Did you leave something behind?" That was the second. Adrian's forehead folded in confusion before he forced the emotion from his face. He tried to prevent his frustration from infiltrating his tone, but after 8 years, Brooke knew him. She'd always known him, hadn't she? "Brooke, where were you going?" She continued to ignore him, and she slowly got closer until there was hardly any space between them. "Did you forget your phone again?" Just one more step and she'll have crossed this river between them. His next demand was effectively cut off when Brooke reached forward, grasping each of his shoulders in her hands. She dug her nails into the material of his suit, brought up one leg, and Brooke buried her knee in his stomach. Immediately, she fell back as he crumpled in on himself, arms wrapping around his body where she'd knocked the air out of him. Leaving behind everything she'd packed, Brooke slipped past him, and she ran like hell. She ran like her life depended on it because maybe it did. The sound of her footsteps raining down on the stairs echoed throughout the house, and the moment she felt the sole of her foot hit the last step, another set of footsteps joined hers. "Brooke!" Adrian bellowed, and her heart leapt to her throat. She had been right earlier. If she didn't leave now, she never would. Adrian yelled her name again, and it spurred her forward, her feet sliding across the hardwood floors as she dove for the table next to the front door. Brooke was absolutely scrambling as she sorted through the key dish, trying to find the one that started her car. Finally, her fingers closed around the correct key, and she heard Adrian reach the bottom of the stairs. "Brooke, stop!" She couldn't, and she threw the front door open wide, bounding down the walkway so she could sprint toward the driver's seat. The rain was pouring now, and Brooke was quickly soaked through her clothes, but she didn't let it slow her. Reaching for the door, she fumbled with her key and tried to fit it into the lock, wishing her car wasn't as old as it was. Her hands were slipping from the rain, and her body was shaking from fear, but she eventually turned the key and was able to pull the handle to open the door. A hand came down on the edge of the door, stopping it from opening. "Brooke," he said evenly, looking down at her. Feeling weak, she lifted her gaze so that she met his face. He was drenched from the rain, his dress shirt clinging to his skin and his dark hair falling down his forehead. Water trailed down his face, so he had to continuously blink the rain out of his eyes. Brooke would have mistaken them for tears had she not known better. "Adrian," she whispered. She couldn't stop shaking from the cold, from the fear, from him. Slowly, so as not to scare her, Adrian lifted his palm and cradled her slit cheek. Instinctually, she let her eyes flutter shut. It was easier with the storm raging around her and the hurricane standing in front of her. "I love you," he said, and then he embraced her. Brooke remained stiff for a second. She was at a loss. One of her friends was married with a family and too far away to help her, and her other friend was thousands of miles farther, unaware that everything she did was a cry for help. Her family was dead, her father wasn't in the picture, and Brooke felt so alone. She had no one to support her, no one to help her. She felt like she had the day of the fire, watching as that man-made disaster took everything from her. Except this time, the things she lost weren't physical. Both her arms dropped to her sides, and Brooke gave up for the last time. Her hands, once balled into tight fists, relaxed, and even though the sound of the rain hitting pavement and the thud of Adrian's heart against her ears engulfed her, she could still hear the small chime of a ring falling to the road. Minute 10. August 3, 2015. 8:17. Brooke stood in front of the floor-length mirror in their bedroom, taking in the cut on her cheek where Adrian had hit her after accusing her of cheating on him again. She hadn't answered Jeremiah's calls in weeks for the sake of avoiding this, but she guessed it didn't matter what she did. It only mattered what Adrian believed. One by one, Brooke removed each article of clothing she was wearing until nothing remained. Her body was a map of cuts and bruises and scars and more scars, and she couldn't look at herself anymore. She couldn't live with herself anymore. Walking into the bathroom, Brooke filled the tub to the brim so that, when she submerged herself, water would lap over the edges and spill onto the tile floor. She glanced down at the letter she clutched in one hand but decided that the words had to drown with her. Brooke's last waking thought was of her brother. She knew it wasn't anything significant or groundbreaking, but she dedicated this last minute of her life to Henry. She remembered him sitting on the back porch with their father, choking on the smoke her father exhaled and laughing at some pointless joke that didn't matter anymore. "You shouldn't smoke around him," Brooke had said, directing the statement at her father. She leaned against the railing opposite their pair of Adirondack chairs, as far from her father and his burning cigarettes as she could manage. "That boy will die of second-hand smoke if he hangs around you for too long." With an exaggerated flourish, her father tacked out his cigarette on the chair's armrest to satisfy Brooke's complaints, but Henry had simply smiled up at her. "It's Dad, Brookie. He's not going to hurt me with a little smoke." He nudged their father. "Plus, I can leave if it starts bothering me. See?" To prove his point, he pushed himself to his feet and strode across the deck in 3 steps, tucking Brooke's head beneath his arm. He was a couple years younger than her, but he was already inches taller. Brooke tried to struggle out of his grasp, scratching at his arm when he mussed her hair. "I'm your older sister," she moaned, finally freeing herself and pushing away from him. "I should be the one doing that to you." Henry and her father had both laughed. That was how it all ended. Her brother did die of second-hand smoke, although not in the way either of them had imagined. Now, Brooke was going to die of second-hand pain, second-hand desperation, second-hand carelessness. Tsunamis are a result of the aftershocks of an earthquake, a second-hand effect. She hadn't done anything when the ground shook, and she didn't run when she saw the wave rise. Brooke thought back to one of her first memories of her husband. "This is not the end of our circle," he'd told her. "Circles don't have a beginning or end, not unless they break." Brooke was prepared to take the hammer to their circle. She was prepared to do anything it took to end this unbearable cycle, this painful back and forth. She knew from her research what happened next. Right before someone moves from drowning to drowned, she's supposed to experience a rush of euphoria. Now, Brooke realized everything she'd read was wrong. It wasn't euphoria. It was peace, release, relief. She had spent so long drowning that she deserved to drown. It wasn't a punishment but a reward. Her lungs had been filling, her body sinking, and it would be utterly unfair to pull her up now. There was a certain point where her brain shut down, and there were parts of her mind that would never come back. He was dark. Death faced her. He approached her. He placed a hand on each shoulder, and he pulled her up. She could not avoid instinct when she gasped. In. Out. In. Out. In. "Oh, my God, Brooke. What have you done?" Item number 015. Case No. D327HL. Item number 015. Found August 3, 2015 on the Bishop's bathroom floor. Paper damaged from water. We were too similar. Epilogue. Case No. D327HL. Status: closed August 7, 2015. Findings: Brooke Rhodes Bishop halted further investigation into domestic violence accusations against Adrian Bishop made by neighbor who called police at 8:19 on August 3, 2015 after claiming to hear signs of an altercation. Neighbor is reported seeing Bishop leave the couple's shared residence moments later, returning again before emergency personnel arrived on scene. Rhodes Bishop refused to testify and insisted all charges be dropped. Postscript: I've been putting off this final author's note because I know I have to write one for this story, but it's so hard to put into words because, up until I posted the epilogue, I was still debating how I should end this story. I rewrote that last paragraph so many times. I wanted to give Brooke a happy ending, but I think this ending is the right one. This isn't a happy story, and it isn't a love story. This is a crime scene. Adrian is a character I have read about hundreds of times. He's broken, possessive, and closed off. Always, the bad boy meets the heroine and she changes him for the better and they live happily ever after. But the boy with anger issues and a drinking problem isn't attractive, and he can't be saved by that one girl because she's special and different from all the others. Adrian wasn't attracted to Brooke because of some indescribable force. He liked her because she looked like the girl he loved, and that is it. He used her. He is simply a selfish, angry, broken man. I have an honest question. Before it was clear he was the villain, did you like Adrian? I can't blame anyone who did. Sure, I loved hints from the very beginning, but we all romanticize characters like him. The reformed bad boy is the trope I have fallen for 1,000 times before. I want to emphasize the danger of idolizing people like Adrian, though, because I don't want any girl thinking this is the type of boy she should want or accept or tolerate. When Brooke first meets Adrian, he's drunk and aggressive. The next time she meets him, he's drunk again, and secretive. He won't even share his full name. The biggest red flag, in my opinion, was his blatant possessiveness. writing the scene where he tells Brooke that he wants her to be his and the thought of her with anyone else makes him dangerous. God, it just felt so creepy. I cringe thinking about those lines. He hurts her. He's afraid of losing her because she's his last connection to missing in action. And he really is dangerous. Another thing I want to emphasize is Brooke's inability to leave him, even after his abusive behavior became painfully clear. Domestic violence is so often grossly simplified. Either the woman is too afraid to leave or she refuses, so she's partly to blame for her situation. It's so much more complex than that, though, especially when you can't bring yourself to hate your abuser. Especially when you love him. By minute 10, Adrian is all Brooke has. She lacks any true support system, and Adrian has isolated her from her friends. Leaving him and starting the new life is nearly impossible. Brooke thought she knew her limits. She thought Adrian's anger was simply a consequence of getting to love him. He's broken her down so that she thinks she can never have better than him. She doesn't think she deserves better than him. Even in the last line, Adrian is breaking her down. What have you done? He blames her, just like thousands of women are blamed for being in abusive relationships. So, in the end, Brooke doesn't leave. There are dozens of stories about women in abusive relationships who escape, but it is important to recognize those who don't have the tools or the support to leave. Leaving isn't easy, and if you are in a situation like Brooke's, you don't deserve this treatment simply because you loved and trusted someone. In the end,